Yeah, they're just getting set up, but the video's on.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give it just another minute or two.
Roll back and get it.
Filter in. For folks who are tuning in from home or remotely, we ask you to please mute your microphone. Good morning, everyone. For those who are just joining, thank you for being here this morning. We're asking everyone who's tuning in to please make sure to mute your microphone. And we'll just give it one more minute before we get started. Thank you.
Buenos días a todos.
Great, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone who's tuning in. My name is Robin Abad-Akabillo, the director of the San Francisco Shared Spaces Program. I'm joined today by our Deputy Program Manager, Monica Munowich at the SFMTA, and we will be providing information about the Shared Spaces Program now that the Board of Supervisors has passed legislation making the program permanent. I'm going to share my screen. And we will get started.
I'm sorry for the interruption. If we can do the announcement for the interpretation function so that everybody can hear you, or I can interpret you.
Shall I do it one more time?
No, just if we can make the announcement that we have an interpreting function. I will do that, and then Laura will follow with the Cantonese instructions, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Muy buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en el evento de hoy. Tenemos para la presentación de hoy tenemos la función, la herramienta de interpretación al español. En unos momentos se va a encender esa herramienta. Van a ver un globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla, o para las personas que están desde un aparato iPhone o una tableta van a ver 3 puntos suspensivos. Solo tienen que hacerle clic y seleccionar el español como su idioma. Laura?
Thank you. 歡迎咧，你哋係參加今日嘅會議。我哋今日嘅會議咧係會提供廣東話同埋西班牙話嘅即時傳譯服務嘅。咁如果咧你哋係需要聽廣東話嘅即時傳譯服務嘅話咧，你哋咧就係可以喺屏幕上邊啦，有一個嘅地球儀嘅標誌嘅。咁你哋咧係撳去地球儀嗰個嘅標誌嗰度咧，就係咧撳去咧就係跟住咧佢就係有一個咧就係語言嘅選擇啦，咁你哋咧就可以係揀咧呢個 Chinese， 即係呢一個嘅中文啦。咁你撳去嗰度咧就係會睇到咧就係有呢一個嘅撳去嗰度咧就可以咧係聽到有廣東話嘅即時傳譯服務噶啦。咁如果咧你哋係用電話嘅話咧，你哋咧就可以係撳咧係3點嗰度，咁然後咧撳去3點嗰度咧，亦都有咧顯示呢一個嘅中文 Chinese 嗰度，咁你哋咧亦都係撳去咧呢一個嘅中文嗰度啦，咁咧就亦都係聽到咧係我哋嘅廣東話嘅即時傳譯服務噶啦，多謝 ，Thank you。
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jose. Great. All right, good morning, everyone. This morning we'll talk a little bit about where shared spaces are and why the Board of Supervisors legislated this program. I'll talk a little bit about the timeline for transitioning from the emergency program into this permanent version of the program and what that means for those of you who have a shared spaces permit. My colleague, the Deputy Director of Shared Spaces, Monica Munowich, will talk about site eligibility for parklets or shared spaces that are in the curbside lane. She'll also talk a little bit about the new rules pertaining to access for persons with disabilities, as well as access for first responders and emergency, in the case of emergencies. I'll talk a little bit after that about grant applications and opportunities for financial assistance that the city is providing. And then we'll have a moderated question and answer. Also, we are joined this morning by Gregory Slocum at Public Works, who manages permits for the sidewalk as well as the curbside lane. The San Francisco Fire Marshal, Ken Coughlin, is also here to take questions. And then the grants manager for the program, Julie Flynn, will also be available to answer questions during Q&A. As our interpreters mentioned earlier, there is live in-language interpretation for this webinar. Please indicate that as described. We'll also, during the question and answer, ask everyone to put their questions in the chat. So if you're tuned in via Zoom, this, what's shown here on the screen is how you are able to enter written questions into the chat. Okay, with that, we'll get into the meat of the presentation. So as a reminder, shared spaces take place in many parts of the outdoors, many places in the public realm. Some of the most famous and visible shared spaces are in the parking lane. We also call these parklets. Many shared spaces are also on the sidewalk. These are those of you who are perhaps serving food on the sidewalk, displaying merchandise on the sidewalk. Shared spaces are also found in open lots or vacant lots on parcels. And then of course, on the street, where we help you close streets to traffic temporarily on a recurring basis for community activities. So there's a great variety of ways that you all have been creating shared spaces throughout San Francisco, and the legislation that the Board of Supervisors passed organizes all of these and creates streamlined permitting for all of them. So this is a key slide or graphic that I'll talk about before passing the microphone over to Monica. What's really important for you to know at this time is that permit applications for renewing a permit are due on November 30th, 2021. So if you currently have, for example, a parklet, your permit will expire at the end of this year. In order to continue operating in the year 2022, you need to submit a permit renewal application by November 30th. You'll also need to fix any issues that your site might have that impede access for people with disabilities, persons with disabilities, or inhibit the ability of first responders like firefighting personnel and paramedics to access a site or a building. Over the last couple weeks and moving forward into the next couple weeks, those of you with issues related to to ADA or to fire will receive a notice describing ways that you can fix the issues at your site. One important thing to note also is that for parklets, fees have been waived by the Board of Supervisors till the end of 2022. Tables and chairs fees have been waived until April of 2021. We know this is a complex graphic, so please, if you have any questions regarding this, put them in the chat like we described earlier. Okay, and with that, I'll pass the microphone over to Monica.
Great, thank you, Robin. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, great. Good morning, folks. So I'll talk a little bit about, in more detail, about some of these specifications Robin referenced that are coming for existing parklet holder or permit holders mainly. So this summer, the SFMTA went out and completed over several weeks and months a pretty extensive assessment of all of our dense commercial corridors to identify where there are parklets, how they may need to move or relocate due to conditions like being too close to an intersection and having daylighting visibility concerns, perhaps being in a zone that where a bus line is coming back. So this program expanded at such a rapid rate over the last year and a half. So a really sort of complete assessment to go into the permitting cycle, then that'll be coming the end of this year for new permits in January. So that assessment was complete this summer. We are starting to notify businesses this month to give as much advance notice as possible, just as a heads up that you've been identified with some of these critical issues as we move into the permanent and a more permanent program. And so giving people that heads up so that when they go to renew or reapply at that end of November deadline for the new year, they'll be responsible for fixing or addressing the various issues that I mentioned. Again, daylighting, loading zones, transit boarding islands are some of the top key priorities. Next slide. So, oh, okay, I think it moved over. Sorry, folks, it was delayed. I do, thank you, so sorry. So that's kind of the SFMTA or sort of the curb function side of things, the eligibility. Robin also referenced the ADA and emergency access, which are things that the program will be starting to enforce now. So people are going to be getting notices now for things like clear path of travel on sidewalks, making sure there's that 8-foot clearance shown on the top left there, 3-foot clearance at that top right image, 3-foot gaps so that fire can access a building in case of an emergency, visibility and airflow above 42 inches, pretty straightforward, shown there on the top right. Other things to point out here, addresses are required, an equivalent ADA or accessible facility is required, reflective materials. So setbacks from the crosswalk, I sort of mentioned on the previous slide, visibility, but these are all high priority issues that was sort of identified through the Board of Supervisors legislative process that we'll be noticing folks to address this coming year ahead of being eligible for a renewal in the new year. Next slide. So I'll just talk a little bit about public access before passing it back over to Robin. Public access means in which ways are non-patrons or members of the public able to access a parklet, and when are there other parameters in place? And so this shows the 3 different types of parklets categories. There's the public parklet, which means it's always available to the public. This existed pre-COVID, so it should be familiar to folks. A new category that we're calling movable parklets. So it's where you would place your tables and chairs out on the sidewalk, bring them back in when you're not in operation. And I'll talk a bit more about the nuances there on the next slide. But just while we have the images up on the right, the commercial parklet, which is what you are most prevalent for shared spaces today. That means the structure that's out there for businesses to use and dine or put in their display merchandise, for example. So next slide shows a little bit more details on these 3 and the public access components. So again, the top row, public parklet, pretty straightforward, always 24 hours available to the public. The movable commercial parklet, during the hours of operation for a business, it's mainly for that business, with the exception of the legislation does have a parameter that there must be 1 seating facility sort of for every 20 feet of parklet, a bench that is for non-patrons. And similar for the commercial parklet, that structure that's out there all the time for the business during operating hours. Otherwise, when non-operating hours open to the public, but that bench should be provided. So it's always available to patrons, even during operating hours. And for all of these, the legislation has parameters around a business may close it up overnight from midnight to 7 a.m. And that's all for me on public access. Now, Robin will talk about grants.
Thank you, Monica. We'll close, before we get to question and answer, we'll close with a little bit of information about equity grant applications, financial assistance that is available to shared spaces permittees in good standing with compliant sites. These equity grant applications are currently open. They are due on November 30th, 2021. You can access the grant information at sf.gov/shared-spaces-equity. The URL is in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. So these equity grants are available for capital improvements pertaining to fixing compliance issues that Monica had just talked about. So we realize that making these adjustments to your site to make them safe and accessible is probably going to take some work and cause some expense. So these grant applications are available as a competitive grant to help offset some of those costs. We also want to be very transparent with everyone that there is a limited amount of funding. We're not able to provide a grant to every single shared spaces operator in order to fix compliance issues at your sites. So there are some very clear criteria that the city is using in order to determine selections. First and foremost, we are looking at geographies, at neighborhoods that have been most deeply impacted by COVID-19, either because there has been a higher rate of cases and or deaths in those geographies or in those parts of the city. We're also prioritizing neighborhoods for this type of assistance that have higher densities of vulnerable populations. And so these are seniors, youth, households that are linguistically isolated or where English is the second language, higher densities of persons with disabilities, and really focusing on those neighborhoods with assistance. Of course, established cultural districts and legacy businesses are also part of this set of considerations for selection. And in order to make sure that the city is dispersing funds as sort of widely as possible, generally, we are looking at applicants who aren't already in receipt of another grant or haven't already received some type of small business assistance grant for their shared space. So this concludes our formal presentation. I will stop sharing screen, and Monica, myself, Gregory, Ken, and Julie can take questions. So thank you everyone for putting questions in the chat. I'm going to start going through these and giving them to my colleagues to respond to. One question is, are slide copies available or accessible? And the answer is yes. The slides we looked at today, as well as this Zoom presentation, it's being recorded and both will be posted. So we will follow up with an email to everyone who registered today with links to access both the slides as well as a recording of this presentation. Here's one question from Evan Bloom, which I am going to defer to Gregory Slocum at the Department of Public Works. Gregory, Evan Bloom asks if all notices are going to be distributed via email.
Hi, we're going to be doing noticing predominantly via email, but I would like a little bit of clarity as to what a notice might entail. Just because we do different notices. We do renewal notices. Robin and his team have been managing comms, which would be another type of notice. Here's what's coming next. And then additionally, if you had an inspection and enforcement issue, that would likely happen in the field, in which case you might be given like a paper receipt with corresponding email to follow. So I don't know if that answers Evan's question totally, but the bottom line is this: because the applications are being received online, we have your email address, and that's likely how you're going to be contacted for the bulk of any type of noticing. So yes, no, not all notices are via email. Inspection and enforcement may occur in the field. everything else should be done via email as well.
Thank you, Evan, for that question. So I think, you know, everyone should definitely pay attention to the email inbox, because some notices for renewal, for example, will be issued up there. And as Gregory mentioned, some notices, for example, those related to the ADA and emergency access issues that we might have noticed at your site, those may be delivered in person. So, so hopefully that helps. Another question that we are getting, let's see, maybe this is another one for Gregory at Public Works from Kenneth Zankel. How, if at all, does the shared spaces program affect the separate program for sidewalk tables and chairs permits? So we were just as a team talking about this morning. If you have a pre-COVID sidewalk tables and chairs permit, you will go through the same renewal process that those permits have always gone through. Gregory, do you care to elaborate on that?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, so as Robin stated, if you have a pre-existing tables and chairs permit, you're likely not going to see any changes. We're going to continue to do renewals. They're going to be processed the same way. The programs complement one another. I think the biggest distinction that I would make is that for tables and chairs, we're going to be seeking to avoid fixed structures to the sidewalk under the cafe tables and chairs permit. The sidewalk needs to have a clear and accessible path of travel, and site conditions are going to dictate what constitutes that path of travel. I know that in the past for tables and chairs, there was talk about the 6 versus 8 foot clearance. And one of the adoptions in the legislation was provision that would enable for greater clearances when deemed necessary by Public Works or a regulatory body. So if you've been in tables and chairs for decades, you've been doing it, I would not expect any dramatic or noticeable changes to what you've been doing. And otherwise, moving forward in the future, if you don't have a parking lane space, we'll work with you on the sidewalk within the regulations for cafe tables and chairs. So not much, they're kind of complementary. You know, it's like the tables and chairs families adopted a new pet almost, that's all.
Another related question from Chris Lehman. If we have a pre-existing tables and chairs permit, would it be possible to have fixtures that do not have to be brought in every night? And the city code still requires that if you have a sidewalk and tables and chairs permit, that you do bring everything in at night. So that requirement or rule has not changed. That continues to be the case. And there are many reasons for requiring this access, cleaning of the neighborhood and so forth. So please remember that if you have a sidewalk, tables and chairs, or a sidewalk merchandising permit, part of the requirement is to bring those fixtures into your premises at nighttime. Let's see. I see a question about sidewalk parklets, and I also see one about grants that I will pass to Julie, a question from Kenneth Zankel in a moment. But first, why don't we address this question from Chris Lehman. Chris asks, is a commercial parklet allowed on a 12-foot wide sidewalk if no parking spot is available because of an afternoon parking zone? So there's two answers to this. Allowed to have a shared space on the sidewalk. It's not a parklet because parklets are only in the parking lane. So this would be a sidewalk tables and chairs permit or a sidewalk merchandising permit on a 12-foot wide sidewalk. Absolutely. As long as you are able to provide a clear path of travel on the sidewalk that is 8 feet wide where physically feasible, or 6 feet wide where physically infeasible, you can put tables and chairs out on the sidewalk as part of your business operations. Now, in terms of a parklet in the parking lane, for one that is an afternoon no parking zone. It maybe is a peak tow-away zone. You can put a parklet there. That's what a tier 2 movable commercial parklet permit is for. These allow businesses to pop up in the parking lane just during certain hours of the day, and then clear the parking lane so that it can be available for, peak travel time demand or other uses at other times of day. So please go to sf.gov/shared spaces to find the description and the rules for being able to pop up in the parking lane when part-time, when the parking lane is needed for other circulation needs at other times of the day. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Julie Flynn to answer a question here from Kenneth Zankel, which is, when will payments for the first round of up to 5K shared spaces construction expenses that folks applied for last February be paid?
Okay, and Robin, can you hear me okay? Just testing. It's the first time I'm talking. Give me a thumbs up. Great. Okay. So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Julie Flynn. I can speak to questions about grants. So I believe this is referring to the first round of grants. Folks applied in the fall of last year and into early of this year. We did make some initial payments. We are hoping to make some more grants. I know it's been, a bit of a lag there. We're finalizing some elements of kind of the payment structure now, and we hope to be able to notify that kind of last wave of people if any more funds are available to them. I would say by the end of September, at the latest, we should be able to provide that news, and that will close out that first round of grants. For our next round of grants, that's just an application that just posted. As Robin mentioned, grants now available to bring your shared space into compliance with the new regulations. We're hoping there will be less of a lag between the kind of wrap up of the final wave of payments. So that's the answer there.
Thank you, Julie. Let's see. I see a question here from Julia O that I think I'll pass to Monica. But before I do that, I'll address a question from Aaron London. Aaron asks, what about partitions? And I think this is partitions over the sidewalk. We have some hanging plexiglass partitions that hang from the awning for our tables and chairs on the sidewalk. We move the tables and chairs indoors at night, but leave the plexiglass partitions in place. The plexiglass is about 4 feet wide and is about 8 feet apart. And even when those are there, there's tons of space for path of travel. So generally, again, the rule that Public Works has is to move all of your fixtures indoors when you're not operating, especially overnight, to secure them against vandalism, to make servicing the street cleaning and other things easier. So that rule still hasn't changed. We encourage everyone as you're putting together your sidewalk shared space or your sidewalk tables and chairs to ensure that you are choosing furnishings and planters and other fixtures that you can secure on your premises overnight. Okay, so question for maybe Monica from Julia O. If we applied and received a new permanent parklet permit and the neighbors would like to keep the parking spots and complain, or I guess revoke their permission to occupy those parking spots, do we have the right to build the parklet?
Sure. Thanks for this question. If I understand it correctly, and feel free to jump in the chat if I missed the intent here, but for permission and consent for neighbors, there is a parameter in the legislation, in the shared spaces legislation around if your business is over 50% to the neighbor, that triggers the need for consent. If it's less than 50%, you do not need to get permission. So I think it depends at your question on the situation with that threshold, but you may or may not be required to submit their permission the neighbor's permission. And if they objected and complained, they didn't agree to it, then we wouldn't be able to extend the permit into that space that is adjacent to the business.
Thank you, Monica. Okay, so Julia notes that we might have misinterpreted her question. So Julia, if you want to further clarify in the chat, maybe we can take a second crack at answering your question. If it, I'm not quite sure what you mean in your message in the chat, but we can give it another go if we have time. Great. So Amparo Vigil asks, if you already have a tables and chairs permit and you've added additional tables and chairs on the bulb out on the sidewalk, is that included? So I'm going to pass this to either Nicholas Persky or Gregory Slocum at Public Works. If you have a tables and chairs permit already established and you add chairs to a bulb out, are your tables and chairs?
No, so if you
I
have,
feel okay. I felt kind of crummy this morning. I was coughing and stuff, but I feel a little better now.
Chris, we're going to ask you to mute. Thank you.
hey, so this is Gregory from Public Works. If you have a pre-existing cafe tables and chairs permit, you're bound to your previously approved plan. All of these applications require some type of plan. For the new sidewalk, for the curbside or parking lane shared spaces, AKA parklets, there's going to be a template that you're required to fill out upon applying. And we've tried to make that as painless as possible, in so much as that it's not required to like hire a design professional to create those plans. But for cafe tables and chairs, you may recall you submitted a plan that we keep on file, and that's part of what we reviewed when we approved your application. If someone changes, the business changes hands, if they want to change the footprint of those cafe tables and chairs, et cetera, they would have to resubmit new plans. So even if there's a bulb out, during the kind of, Robin, what are we calling the pandemic program? There may have been some latitude, like, hey, if you have clearances, you can make an affirmation that you do in the course of applying. You could place them there, but for a permanent program, we definitely had to have defined parameters of occupancy. And as such, if you were to seek to keep those chairs, you would have to reapply for a new tables and chairs permit, or reach out to our team to see what the next steps would be. But you cannot just add them as kind of like just kind of running the tab up more. That's all.
Thank you, Gregory. Yes. So if you want to expand your sidewalk shared space and put more tables and chairs, put more out, please let us know. That's important information for us to make sure that we're checking to make sure everything is happening safely and in an accessible manner. And then so that we also have situational awareness for things that are happening on the street as we try to coordinate and ensure that there is harmony with all the different operators who are seeking to activate the public realm. Addressing another question by Evan here, Evan Bloom, is there anything different needed for an application if the shared space is moving? As in Evan's case, they have to move the parklet down one space. And yes, generally, anytime there is movement or you're resizing your parklet, you want to resize your parklet. We ask you to basically submit an application, right? Tell us using the application portal that you're doing that. You might have to resize because we've noticed you. We've sent you a note asking you to resize, in which case you work directly with MTA and DPW to do so. Let's see, a question here from Chris Nicolopoulos to everyone. How will the 7 a.m. open requirement be enforced? If you operate a restaurant that is open only in the evenings, this would be financially prohibitive. So this is a great question, Chris. We want to remind everyone that it's not a requirement to secure or close your parklet between the hours of 12 a.m. and 7 a.m. It's something that you may do if you like. So if you choose to do that, if you choose to secure or close your parklet overnight, the law says that it doesn't need to be open as of 7 a.m. So some of you may elect not to secure or physically close, physically secure your parklet overnight. That's up to each individual merchant. Before the pandemic, closure was not an option. It was not legal. And so with the legislation that the board just passed, they are allowing folks to, code does allow parklet sponsors to do this if they want, but only between the hours of 12 to 7. Let's see, what other questions do we have here that we haven't addressed yet? Maybe this is a good one for you, Monica, at the MTA. Another question. Hector, we're going to ask you to mute. Thank you so much. A question for Monica Munowich at the MTA from Evan Bloom. Our street is a permanent slow street. Are we still required to keep our parklet 20 feet from the corner?
That's a great question. Yes, I believe so. Yes, I believe so. There's still, slow streets don't totally close the street down to vehicle traffic. There's still obviously local access. And so the same, while significantly less traffic, there is still visibility concerns that are prevalent regardless of the slow street. So no, there's not a policy in place that we're treating slow streets any differently.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, great question, Evan. All right, so looping back to Julia O, another question she asks is, do you need approval from the neighbor if the parklet or the parking space is only in front of your business or in front of your storefront? And the answer is no. You only need consent from a neighboring business or a neighboring storefront or tenant if the parking space that you wish to occupy is 50% or more in front of them. So if it's less than half in front of someone else, you don't need written permission from that neighbor in order for the city to issue you a permit. Another question for Monica that's related to the question just asked by Evan Bloom. This is a question from Lauren Heater, and the question is, how many feet from a crosswalk does the parklet need to be?
Hi, oh, sorry. There is 20 feet clearance required near side and 8-foot clearance on the far side. So depending on where you are on the intersection, what side of the intersection, if you're before or after, there's different sort of need for visibility depending on the turning movement. So it's designed better than I can describe in our design manual, but it's either 20 feet or 8 feet.
Great, right. It depends on whether you are entering the intersection or exiting. The clearance dimension is different. And Monica, would it help to explain why we have these clearance dimensions? I think some folks might know, but maybe not everyone does.
Sure, of course. So at intersections, depending again on the placement of the intersection, when cars turn, so if you're perhaps making a right turn, for example, it can be often, depending on the angle, hard to see a pedestrian. So one of the biggest Vision Zero treatments we have at the MTA and in the city is to put daylighting, what's called daylighting, which is the painting of the red curb to ensure that clearance, so cars can't park right up until the intersection, block it, and kind of preclude that visibility needed to ensure safe turning movements and visibility of people of all sizes, kids, slower folks crossing the intersection. So it's a really critical and effective treatment. That's why we do it, and doing it citywide and in particular in commercial corridors. So that's what those red curbs are if you ever see them at intersections.
Thank you, Monica. Yes, Vision Zero is one of the city's core policies, and part of achieving zero deaths is making sure that folks operating vehicles can see folks who are walking or biking around. So that visibility is really, really important for us, eliminating traffic-related fatalities. So Chris Nicolopoulos asks, assuming we will need to make improvements to our existing parklet, so we can qualify for permanent status? How much time will we be given to make the required improvements? This is a great question, Chris. Currently, everybody's permits expire at the end of December 2021. So we're in the process of sending everyone notes or notices if there are issues related to ADA and emergency access. And what we would like is for everyone to address those issues before the end of the year to qualify for a permit renewal that will begin in January. Public Works and Fire Department staff is going to work with each of you on achieving that compliance. We realize that some issues are a little bit bigger and more complex than others in order to fix. So I think as long as our enforcing departments can see that there is progress and that you are addressing the life safety and disability access issues that have been flagged, we can work with you to make sure that you can continue operating. So let's see, we have a question from Cody Laxo who asks, if we are hoping to make some adjustments to our outdoor seating, like installing permanent heaters attached to the building and plant walls that fold against the building outside of open hours, and dividers that fold out for ambience during business hours. Should we reach out to shared spaces or sitting planning for guidance and approval? So for any attachments that you're making to the facade of your building, whether those are heaters or it sounds like these flexible, movable diverters, you are definitely going to need to work with the Department of Building Inspection. They are going to help make sure that the heating installation that you have, the installation of heating elements, and these other elements that you are attaching to your building frontage are structurally sound and of course meet building code. Let's see. We're hitting almost every question. And I see that there's some follow-ups from Julia O and Evan Bloom and others. Some of the questions that folks are asking might be a little bit complex to get into in this setting. So what we can do is follow up with you individually via email about your specific case or by other means outside of this setting. Let's see. Aaron London asks, regarding the need for getting a neighbor's permission for using a parking space that is half or more than half in front of your neighbor. Does the 50% rule apply the same to residential tenants? Yes, the permission applies to whoever the ground floor tenant is. So that could be another business. It could be a residential tenant. And so if that parking space is half or more in front of another building that is not the building that you are in or the storefront that you have, you do need to seek permission from that ground floor tenant. All right, everyone, thanks for your patience. Lots of good questions coming in. Emmy Kaplan asks, how will you ensure that all shared spaces are equally compliant? It seems like most are non-compliant and everything tends to be compliant based only. I think I understand really clearly the first part of that question, which is how will we ensure that all shared spaces are equally compliant? The city departments that work together on this program, DPW, the fire department, MTA, planning, the mayor's office of disability, we're coordinating on making sure that we are monitoring and keeping track of all shared spaces, and that we are noticing all of you eventually about the issues at your site that you will need to fix in order to be, again, safe and accessible. So right now, during this fall, the program is focused on ADA and emergency access requirements pretty exclusively. These are issues that the Board of Supervisors were very specific with all of us about in the legislation that they passed over the summer. They even went so far as to make fines and fees a recourse that the city could take for fixing issues, gaining compliance around ADA and emergency access compliance. So there are many, many shared spaces out there, and it's going to take us all time to make sure that they are compliant. It's going to take all of you time to fix issues that are noted. And so we know this is going to be a long process that's going to take all of us doing our part to make sure that shared spaces are safe and accessible. That being said, we do encourage everyone to report or note any concerns that they have via 311. 311 is the best way for us as a city team to monitor and keep track of what is going on out there. It's a supplement to the on-site inspections that we already conduct. And it's the city's body of record. When you submit a concern to 311, it triggers the requirement for us to formally follow up and investigate or look into it. So that's still the best place. If you as a citizen have a concern about something that you're seeing, we'll look into it if you submit something to 311 regarding that address. See, other questions. Amparo Vigil asks, where can I email questions about my current tables and chairs permit to ensure that our Parklet is included or not? Gregory, do you want to answer this question and maybe put that contact email in the chat?
Yeah, I can put some info in there, and then hopefully, if just to be clear, if you had a shared space, you basically are reapplying new permit, new process. That's not to say that you may not be able to retain some of the elements of occupancy that you've been enjoying throughout the course of the last year, but I would basically treat it more like a new process than we all want it to be quite frank. And I would say, if you had something that was pre-existing, as I mentioned before, you're required to still comply with the meets and bounds of any approved plans. And if you put something out temporarily through the pandemic or under the previous iteration of this program, you're going to be required to reapply for that space. The good news is that there's no fees associated with these applications, but things like filling out that template for your Parklet, if you've never sent us any type of plans or demonstration of your occupancy, that's something that you will be having to do. So I'm going to answer the actual question and put an email in here. But in the course of answering that question, I also wanted to speak topically to kind of the greater issue that was raised, that like, there's no grandfathering, there's no exceptions, there's no variances. We've set out clearly defined rules for this program. We'll seek to accommodate and serve you to the greatest extent of our ability. And I can tell you, the Shared Spaces team is a great city team. You have people that are very dedicated to their work, that are working very hard to serve you, and that are seeking to make this the best user experience it can possibly be, despite all of the circumstances that have been facing your industry. So I have supreme confidence that together we will work through this transition. And I'm also aware that it does provide challenges to our restaurants. We will seek to assist you. So give me one moment here. I'm throwing Shared Spaces permit at SFDPW into the chat there. And that's a good, just general inbox for us. But also, the digital services team did a great job of kind of putting information on the website. So if you haven't checked it out, take a spin on that first. If you don't see it there, let us know, because if it's a reoccurring concern, we're going to want to make sure that the rest of the community is aware of it as well through communications. That's all.
Thank you, Gregory. Yes, the Shared Spaces website at sf.gov/shared spaces has been recently updated last week with all of this information. So it's absolutely the best place to start. And if it's not clear from the revised website what you need to do or what rule applies, please go ahead and email us. There is a question in the chat, just scanning all the inbound questions here from Debbie. And Debbie asks, when will the shared spaces permit application be available? It's available now. Go to sf.gov/shared spaces, again, for information, as well as a link to submit a permit renewal application or a fresh permit if you're doing shared spaces for the first time, or shared space for the first time. So let's see. So Aaron asks, what department determines rules that supersedes another department? If we get different answers from DPW, planning, SFMTA, the Entertainment Commission, et cetera, who do we have to listen to? So first of all, this is not something we hope you ever have to experience moving forward. So if you ever have a question, please email us at sharedspaces@sfgov.org, and we will work to figure out how to help you move forward. Part of the Board of Supervisors legislating this program and transferring it from a temporary emergency pandemic response to a permanent program was to make sure that we aligned all the rules and it was really clear what all the rules are. So of course, sometimes this happens, there's confusion, but we will, the departments will work together to make sure that the program is providing one answer to you. Okay, let's see, there is a question from Mateo Rutherford, or rather a note from Mateo. So if you wish to ask a question in Spanish, you can write that question in Spanish in the chat, and Mateo or Luis will translate it for us, and we can address it. So this is maybe a question for Monica at the SFMTA from Aaron London. What about existing parking meters? Now that the program has gone permanent, can we either remove or have the city remove parking meters outside of a parklet? They hinder path of travel and access to the parklets. So there was a way that we dealt with parklet meters pre-COVID, but I'll turn it over to Monica to talk about parking meter removal.
Sure. So certainly this is something we've heard, a parking meter can get in the way. We are going to be taking away likely the device at top, but not the pole. So the pole requires a little bit more labor intensive in time and in sort of budgeting out, and in reality was not something that we could deliver on and provide to businesses across the city for our parklets, but we are will likely remove the device, either the first printed bag, or they can go and completely remove the device. But as of now, at the scale of parklets, there is not a plan for the poles to be removed across the city.
Thank you, Monica. Great, just keeping an eye on the chat for, I think we've addressed pretty much every question. Aaron asks, as a follow-up, hi, I'm Monica, can we remove the parking meter at our own cost? They are dangerous and inhibit ADA access. And so I think Aaron, before Monica answers, she just made the distinction between there's the meter, which is the device that sits at the top of the pole, and there's the pole itself. So I don't know if you mean the meter or the pole. I'm pretty sure the only person who can remove a meter is somebody on Monica's team, but I'll let Monica answer that. He means the pole. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Let's talk more offline, Aaron. Potentially, right, potentially, but it still may be, in full transparency, not an immediate thing. Our shops have like a long queue of already like hundreds of locations they have to go out and remove poles for other reasons. And so it could be a possibility if cost is not a problem, but it would just, there need to be probably further discussion about when. Is it like a 6 months? We have to ask them, is it 6 months? How long is their queue right now? I think they have like 2 people that go out across the city and do this. But certainly it's something we can discuss more about.
And something maybe also to think about, Aaron and others, is that it's not only the cost of removal, but restoration. We should all remember that parklets themselves are not permanent installations. These are temporary installations that for which permits are issued for a year at a time, right? So one day in the far future, we might have a city where there is no on-street parking. I don't think we're anywhere near that. So parklets are a creative solution for maintaining flexibility of the curb that we'll need over the long run. So, we might take the parking meter off of the top of the pole for a couple years or even, many years. But it may be that that infrastructure needs to get, restored to that particular location as the dynamics of circulation and transportation in a neighborhood change. So just remember, we're not just talking about removal. We also all have to think about restoration. Okay, another question from Amparo Vigil. This might be a great one for Monica to take from her role at the MTA. We have some flexible white poles outside our parklet, which have previously been knocked over and broken. So they become dangerous for people who are walking or riding bikes. Now with the parklet, the bulb out is non-existent. I wonder if we're talking about a painted safety zone here. Can we have the flexible white poles removed permanently? Monica, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I'm trying to, at first I was confused by white poles. I was picturing white painted parking meters. So right, sounds like the white flex hip post for a bulb out or painted safety zone at a corner. Likely it's needed and it's there for visibility concerns. So if they're down, it's probably more of like if it wanted to keep a 311 notification, it needs to be put back up. I couldn't answer with certainty about I understand if they're down, it's totally a hazard, but preserving the painted safety zone is likely what the city would need to do. So it'd be about restoring it, but certainly perhaps maybe there is a location that there's some other issue going on, but likely, not removing the zone entirely, probably just replacing the material to ensure it's safe.
Great. I see a question from Michael Kapash, which I'll address in a minute, but in the meantime, a question from Emmy Kaplan. I think we'll take this and then Michael's, and then we'll break. As we're nearing the end of time, before we break, we'll again provide some more information about where you can find additional information. Emmy asks, can you explain how lights should be strung to a parklet besides going across the sidewalk on the ground with the cover? We tried this solution and it does not work for ADA people on the street. Even with the very small bump, it has proved difficult for them to cross it in a wheelchair. Thank you, Emmy, for this question. So this is one option for getting electricity from your building or your storefront to the parklet, across the sidewalk to the parklet in the parking lane. One is to put a cable cover or cable ramp on the sidewalk over the cable. But as Emmy mentioned, a lot of times the way that these are designed are not optimal for folks who are mobility impaired, maybe moving around with a walker or a wheelchair, or even parents with strollers and the like. So the other option is to string it overhead. And actually, the fire marshal is here with us, and I might hand it off to Fire Marshal Ken Coughlin with the fire department to address this question. Chief, are you here? Chief, if you are here, I think you might be muted. Okay, well, maybe while while Fire Marshal Coughlin is sorting out audio. You can provide electrification to your parklet, you know, an electrical cable overhead, over the sidewalk, and connect, as long as the cable connection to your building is plugged into an outlet or a socket that can be easily unplugged.
Can you hear me, Robin?
I can hear you now, Chief. Go for it.
Sorry about that. Yeah. No. So I'm not sure what you covered. I just had to reset real quick. But yeah, so like Robin stated, having an exterior weatherproof outlet where the lights or the heater cords can plug directly into. They fly over from the building directly to the parklet, but they have to be placed on the ends. That space between the building and the parklet is very important for fireground operations. As you know, we've put up ladders against the building, and we need something that can easily be relatively easily unplugged, either by the ladder when it's going up or a ceiling hook. So we ask that the cords be at one end or the other of the parklet, plugged directly into an outlet that can be easily unplugged with a pole or a ladder. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you, Chief. You can also look at the new Shared Spaces manual. I'm about to put that link in the chat for diagrams and examples of how to address these issues. So you can go to sf.gov/shared-spaces-manual for helpful diagrams and visuals addressing a lot of the questions that people brought up today. Great. So Michael Kapash asks, where can you find the application form? There's only, let's see, Michael says that there are two application forms. Michael, there's actually should only be one at sf.gov/shared spaces. So there's only one application form for sidewalk or parklets. There's one place that you go to submit a renewal application or a fresh permit application. So we're just about at time, and I want to thank everyone out there for all the work that you're doing in your neighborhoods, keeping them safe, serving your communities. We know that you are doing incredibly difficult work under a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety about your future. So, you know, on behalf of myself, the rest of the Shared Spaces team, and Mayor Breed, we're very grateful for everything that you're doing, and especially doing this in a manner that is safe and accessible for everyone who, you know, moves through and comes to our neighborhoods for services. So this presentation will be posted on the Shared Spaces website at sf.gov/shared-spaces-media. We'll put that in the chat. We'll post both the recorded Zoom session as well as the slides themselves for your reference. Please note also that we will have another webinar with the same content next Wednesday. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to make today, please encourage them to register for that second webinar. It's not going to be any new information. It's just another opportunity for folks who couldn't make it today to be able to ask questions and have those answered. So with that, I think Monica, myself, Gregory, Ken, and Julie will sign off and wish everyone a good day. Thank you.